the grant requirements of our application. Ross, take it away.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much. Like she said, I'm Ross Heidecker, the Senior Manager of Institutional Giving at Genesys Works Houston. I'm a fundraiser. Most of my work involves writing grants to private foundations, corporations, and the government. I raise about $1.5 million every year, primarily through grants. So sometimes it's sponsorships and other things, but mostly grants. So we can move on into tips for how to write a successful grant. If you want to go to the next, yeah, awesome. So before you even write a grant, you have to pick the right RFP or request for proposal to write the grant. And so my first thing is do research on the organizations that you're looking into. Does your organization even fit within their guidelines? I've definitely written grants based on research that somebody else did and written a grant and then got a letter back that says, hey, that's not our guidelines at all. So make sure that you do your research. Sometimes you'll come across organizations that say we only give to pre-selected organizations. That's fine. Those are usually smaller family foundations. If you can find the trustee list, maybe you can give it to your board and see if anybody knows any of the trustees. That's one way to sort of get in with those organizations. Otherwise, it's not really worth your time applying because they're not going to even read your application, honestly. So most of the large private foundations are going to have a website. Even if it's very basic, they're going to have a website, and that has all sorts of information on it. So application deadlines, the things necessary to fill an application out, the forms that are needed, like tax forms and stuff like that. Everybody wants something different, and also contact information for the folks at those foundations. For the smaller foundations, sometimes they don't have a website, and that's okay. This is where tax form 990 becomes your friend. I would say get really good at reading form 990s. You can Google those. You can find them on GuideStar. That's all fine. Also, Foundation Center Online will have them. They have a free version that you can use. There's a paid subscription version. It's kind of pricey. Foundation Center Online. It's worth the money if you have the budget for it. The free version will give you basic information. Sometimes they have 990s, sometimes they don't. But 990s are publicly available information. You just kind of have to go look for them. But they'll have all sorts of things like the trustees of the organization that you're looking at, how much money they give away, generally speaking, a contact person. So you can reach out if they don't have a website or anything, you can reach out and find out what their guidelines are or even what their giving priorities are. And then also really important in 990s, there's a section towards the bottom that shows who else organizations give money to every year. And a tip there is to, no joke, look through it and see, are there other organizations in town that they're giving to that are similar to ours, or there are none on here that are similar to ours. And neither of those are bad things. If they give to a lot of folks like your organization, awesome. Maybe they'll fund yours too. If they don't, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That just means that maybe somebody hasn't approached them about funding organizations like that. So the next one is don't be afraid to reach out, at least to private foundations. It's literally someone's job to talk to you. On the websites, they're always going to have contact information. It may be like an info@whatever.org. That's fine. Send an email and say, hey, I have questions. I would like your guidelines if they don't have them, or I would like a 20-minute conversation to see if, we fit within your guidelines. Once again, this is where 990 comes in. They made us have a generic email address in that form 990 and no other information on the internet. Send that email, an email, just send them one. And a lot of times somebody will get back to you. And most of the time they're very pleasant because it's their job to talk to you. So don't let a lack of being able to find stuff stop you. Just do a little bit of research. You can probably find a way to talk to these folks. The difference here is corporations. Okay, so corporate foundations, corporate CSR departments, corporate ESG, a lot of times it's very difficult to find these folks. I'm not saying they don't want to be found, but they don't put their information on their corporate websites. There are a few major corporations. I think like here in town, Centerpoint has a big foundation. You can just look that up. But the other ones, it takes some research. Ask your board. Does anybody know anybody at this company? And do you know somebody within that company to get money? Because like, let's say you work for the food bank or something. Like Cisco Foods is here in town. I'm sure they're connected. But if they weren't and Cisco didn't have a website, you could just say, hey, does anybody know anybody at Cisco? And maybe somebody does, right? So that's my recommendations there. One thing that's not on my slides is government RFPs. I'm not going to get into that. That's a whole, I could talk 2 hours about just government RFPs. If you have questions about that, I do government grants. Send me a personal email. We can talk about it offline. So next slide. Awesome. So actually writing a grant itself, I'll go through the main components of what it takes to write a successful grant. Your organizational description or organizational history, keep it short to the point, half a page, no more than that. Your year established and where you operate. So the year established is important because if you've been around 100 years, they're probably going to judge you a little different than if you've been around 2 years, right? So they just want to know, you've been around a long time or are you new? And then where you operate, they're just trying to make sure that you're operating in the areas that they actually fund. Your mission statement, I mean, everybody has one, make sure you put it in there. Impact numbers, very important. Impact shows, at least in this capacity here, it should show the total impact your organization has had over its entire history. Like we have served X amount of meals to the homeless over how many years, or we've had X amount of dogs adopted in 25 years, or whatever it is. It's just showing that we've been around this long, we've done this many things. Doesn't have to be long, a sentence or two will suffice. If you have more than that, you can put it in there, but you don't really have to. And then a very brief program description, no more than 2 or 3 sentences about sort of further explaining your mission statement. The reason you don't want to give too much away here is because the next section of a grant is your program description. So here, my boss always says to me when I get too long-winded, be a Hemingway, not a Faulkner, right? More short and to the point. That will be a running theme throughout this presentation. So we can go to the next one. All right, so your program or your project description, this is the meat of a proposal. It tells potential funders who you are and what you do. So my recommendation is this: develop 2 versions of a project description, at least 2, but I would say 2. Because of character limitations, sometimes you'll run across a funder that says, we don't care how long it is. You can send us 50 pages on, what you're doing, and maybe they'll read it, maybe they won't, but they don't care how long it is. Take them up on that. Write a long form that seriously describes every single thing that your program does. And so the reason for that is it shows how you perform the work that you do. So like, what are the components that make up your program or project? So for us here at Genesys Works, our core program has 4 main components. For each of those components, I write a half of a page probably about what that component is and why it's important and necessary to the overall success of the organization. I mean, serious details, like I go into one of our components is technical training skills for young adults. And I go into what that is down to like how to shake somebody's hand or how to ride an elevator or how to dress for a business lunch. List those things out because they are important. Also involved in the long form, do you utilize volunteers in your organization? If you do, in what capacity do you utilize those volunteers? Because that's very important. We don't rely on them heavily to actually perform our programs here, but it's important to talk about it in case potential funders want to come in and volunteer with us. I always give like very specific examples, like, do you buy dog food directly to save costs, or do you have some sort of inside industry connection that allows you to go about your program or your project with more efficiencies than if you didn't have those sort of connections? Do you partner with outside organizations that makes your work easier? Community connections are important. A lot of the major funders in town won't give you money unless you are connected to other organizations in town, or maybe they will give you money, but then they'll have suggestions on, hey, you should probably reach out and partner with these other folks, or at least know who they are. Really, the point of this whole thing is to give a full picture of what your organization does and how it does it. And my long form program description is probably 2.5 pages long. Like it's lengthy, but it really does give every single detail of every individual component. Now, what I want to tell you is that's the easy part, right? Writing as much as you want about your program, that's easy. The next part is where it gets tricky, is you need to make a short form bare bones version of this, because you're going to run into grant portals and limitations on how much you can write. So it'll either be character limits, word limits, or page limits. I would pare this down as far as you can. I think I have one that's like 500 characters. So I was saying a minute ago, each component of my long form is, a solid half a page. Each component of my short form is maybe 2 sentences. This is hard, and it's going to take a lot of edits to get it right. You'll have to have other people in your organization read it to make sure that you're not missing anything. But once you get it down, you're set, because then you have it, you stick it in your boilerplate files, and you're good to go. And that way, you know that if somebody says, oh, you only get 500 characters, it's like 3 tweets to describe your whole organization, you can do that. And you have it ready to go, and you don't have to write it again And then if they up the character limits or you come across proposals that need more, you can just pull in chunks from your long form, and it makes your work easier. One thing I wouldn't put in here is the problems or issues that you're like addressing or solving. That's for another section. That's for the next section we're going to go into. Really, this is about who you are and what you do. So we can go to the next slide. All right. So what I was just saying, you're addressing a problem. That's your needs statement. And I use the cone method. That's not like something out in the world. Me and my boss have just talked about this for years. So here's a graphic of a cone. Start broad, narrow it in, and talk more specifically as you get closer to the point. So to illustrate this, like here, we serve young adults and we help them with professional and technical skills training. We teach them about careers in college. We get them a paid internship for a year. And so we're getting them towards the economic mainstream. That's what we do. And so I start by saying, hey, look, youth disconnection is a thing in the United States. Here's a bunch of research from the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics that demonstrate this problem exists at a national level. Then I say, okay, that's awesome that exists at a national level. At the state level, here's state statistics that the state of Texas is saying, here in Texas, this is happening. Once again, backed up with data. And then you go further and I say, here in Houston, the greater Houston area, in Harris County, there's X amount of disconnection for youth. And then for minorities, there's X amount of disconnection. So here's what we're dealing with. National, state, here locally where we operate. And then this is specifically where you say, this is how we're making a difference. This problem exists, our organization exists, and we do this program that I just talked about. I'm not gonna ever say we solve a problem, like I'm never gonna claim that. But I will say we are helping to alleviate these issues or the underlying things that cause this issue, right? It's really important to back all this up with data. It exists, whatever you do, like whatever field you're in. Someone did some research and it exists. It takes a little bit to find it. It's not fun. It is my least favorite part of every December. I do this for the next year. I go through and spend a couple weeks finding updated data, but it needs to be timely. I would say no older than 18 months, 2 years. If you're getting stuff from 10 years ago, it's not, I mean, it's applicable, but I'm sure there's newer research that maybe paints a different picture. And like I said, say data really is the backbone of your argument. And then you can say, look, these things exist. Here's how we're fixing it. So, all right, measurement evaluation, super important. Doesn't matter if you're a year old, doesn't matter if you're 100 years old. You need to do it. And if you aren't doing it, start doing it. Basically, as far as the proposal goes, you need to explain the methods that you use to track and evaluate your outputs and outcomes. So outputs are short-term, what you do on a given year-to-year. Outcomes are long-term impacts. I'll give just examples of what we do. We use Salesforce. And so our outputs every year, our program staff tracks, I mean, everything from how many students applied, how many students actually started training, how many students made it through training, how many students got an internship, how many scholarship dollars did they get, who went to college, where did they go, all of those things. And it's not just important for you to say that you did them. If you do get funding, you're going to have to report out on what you did. And so it's easy to just have your M&E happen. And then you go, oh, okay, I can just go talk to whoever's doing it. Or if it's you, then you can just pull your data so that you can report out. Outcomes are, like I said, the long-term, that's more of impact. And so we have a separate way of doing that. Make sure that you describe, if you are tracking outcomes, what that is. So for us, we have folks who reach out to alumni of our program and say, hey, you're 5 years out. What are you doing in life? And then they take that down in a survey. That's going to look different for every organization, but you do need to look at long-term outcomes. And once again, describe how that happens. Because funders truly are interested in the methods in which you're going about tracking your information, and not just like for how you're doing it, so that they can compare you to other organizations and say, hey, look, there's a similar organization that tracks it like this, because they talk to a lot of folks in town. And so we're not existing in a vacuum. Another section here that you can talk about at the bottom of measurement evaluation, if you're looking at how this goes into the proposal, is talk about impact. If you have had studies or something done, you can throw it in here. So I always throw in information like about our alumni survey, whatever data comes back that year, I pare it down to 3 or 4 sentences and I say, hey, in the 6th annual survey or whatever, here's what we have found. And then we commissioned a study from Columbia University, I don't even know how long it was, 5 or 6 years ago. And it's like, for every $1 that you give to us, there's a $13 social return on investment. So if you have studies like that, it's important to showcase them. Just make sure that it's short, a paragraph and to the point. And then we can go to the next slide. We're getting to the end here. Budgets. I'm not going to go into like describing how to write a budget for each individual proposal, because that's going to come down to what a foundation is looking for and a lot of Excel work. But every proposal that you send in, they're going to ask for an organizational and or project budget. I would organize it literally like I have it here on the screen. Show your revenues. If you do earn money, we do as a nonprofit, show it. Otherwise, it's going to be mostly contributed or philanthropic dollars and then in-kind. It is really important to show in-kind dollars if you are an organization that depends heavily on that, because it does make up a large portion of your budget, perhaps. For us, it's not as big of a thing. I still put it in there, even though it's a couple $1,000s. It's important for people to see that we do have organizations that give us things that help us do things that are not strictly monetary. For expenses, I would not go super into detail here. For program expenses, maybe have 4 or 5 categories like staff salaries. I don't even know, but like 4 or 5 categories, no more than that, because I know on everybody's budget, you're going to have 16 or 17 different lines or have 30, condense those down. Same thing for G&A and fundraising. You don't want to show a lot of detail here. This needs to fit on a page. And so if you're showing your whole budget, I'm sure it's 3 or 4 pages. If a foundation is interested in more information, they will come back and ask you for more detail. I've never had it happen. In all of these years of doing this, I've never had a foundation go, hey, we need more detail, unless I'm specifically providing a project budget specific to that grant, showing how I'm going to spend their money. And that's an entirely different conversation. But as far as for what is needed to be externally shareable, less than a page, short and simple. And if they need more, they'll come back to you. And so that makes, honestly, those are the components of writing a good grant, quick and easy. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. Also, that's my email address. If you ever want to email me, I'm always around and I'm willing to answer questions about this. I help all sorts of nonprofit folks all the time about how to work through grant stuff. So yeah, I'll take questions, and otherwise, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ross. We actually have 2 questions in the chat. The first question is from Tay Lonis. Says, if you are grant writing for a newly established organization and do not yet have results, would you supplement expected or your estimated impact into your proposal instead?
Yeah, you can always do that. And just say, this is what we expect to happen. And honestly, like, I put things like if we're doing innovation grants or something where we're trying to expand, it's very similar to being new. Organizations understand that, especially if they actually end up giving you funding. They know that you expect certain things to happen. And I don't know what sector you're in, but programming never goes the way you expect it to the first time. That's expected. Just my statement here is to be very open and honest with your funders. If you get halfway through the grant period and something wonky's happening and it's not looking like it's going to go how it's supposed to, communicate that with your funders. They're not going to pull funding back. They're just going to go, okay, let's talk about this and see if there's something you can do differently next year to work through it. For the most part, they're always very nice. But yes, definitely include that sort of information.
And we have another question. What is G&A? I'm not sure if that.
Oh, yeah, sorry, general and administrative. So like, do you have operations staff? So folks that are not directly involved with programming, but they're not fundraisers. So like if you have an office manager, or you have, like we have the corporate partnership staff, they're technically sales. We don't call it that, but that's technically what they're doing. They don't fall necessarily into program. And so it's a different bucket of money. And the reason that's important is because it will show the percentage of funds that are your revenues that you're spending on your program versus your fundraising staff versus like just the operations of keeping the lights on and doing business.
Okay, I'm just gonna put your email on the chat here for anyone who may have missed it on the slides. We have one more question. Do you recommend national grant programs or local for newer nonprofits?
Both, whoever will listen. Honestly, local's easier because the national things, like if you're, I'm gonna make something up here, but like if you're looking at Bank of America or somebody who operates across the country, they probably have local options. Like I know for a fact Bank of America has a local grant program. They also have a massive, much larger funding bucket at the national level. I would say it's whoever you can get in front of and talk to. It's much easier to get grant funding if you've had a conversation with somebody. Always send an email. If it's a new foundation you're talking to, they're there to talk to you. Send them an email and say, hey, look, we're looking at applying. And if it's a national person, they may say, great, yes, apply through the national office. They may kick you down to the local level and say, actually, we think you'd be better with our local contact, whoever, right? And so that would be my recommendation there.
Yeah, that's a good point. As far as the HYLF grant is concerned, we do require that the grant funds impact the Houston community. So there may be some locality restrictions on the funding. So you just want to make sure that you're applying to the appropriate place as well. Does anyone else have any other questions? I think we have time for a few more. I don't see any. So hearing none, thank you so much, Ross. I really appreciate you presenting for us today and letting people know how to get some grant funding.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. And we will turn it over to Leah, who is going to talk about the HYLF grant and take any questions specific to our grant application process.
Great. Brenda, actually, one question just came through for Ross. It was any suggestions where to search for grants?
Oh, yeah. So Foundation Center Online, like I said, they have a free version that you can type your queries into. It's not going to give you the biggest level of detail as far as like, it's not going to give you trustee lists, and it's not going to necessarily give you all the information you need, but it will at least tell you if you're looking in Houston for, I don't even know, homelessness or something, you can type that in. It's just a database, and it will pull up the names of foundations here in town. And then it's just a matter of clicking through them and reading information, and then going and doing further research to see if they have their own websites and things like that, and then reaching out to folks. It's just a lot of time. That's my favorite online directory. There's other ones. I don't find them to be as complete. GuideStar is another one you can look at, Charity Navigator, but they don't necessarily tell you the categories that people are giving to. So my first bet is always to start with Foundation Center Online.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, everybody. Hi, for the second half of our program, my name is Leah Nommensen, and I am the grants chair for the Houston Young Lawyers Foundation. So we have our own grant program, and so our rules are a little bit nuanced for what we're looking at, and Ross had some great points. And so what I'm going to do is walk you through our grant application requirements and some conditions that we require for our applications. And if you have any questions at the end, I'm an open book. As Ross said, we're happy to answer any questions. It's not really productive if you say, hypothetically, this is what the grant would be, would we qualify? I can give you some examples of programs that we have funded in the past, but ultimately our grants committee is made up of, anywhere from like 8 people, and we all take turns reviewing the applications and then have a big discussion on who we believe best fits HYLF's stated purposes, which I'll go over with you. So ultimately it's a group decision, and the best grants for that application cycle are the ones that get funded. But it doesn't mean that they don't all fit our purposes or that we don't want to fund them. It's just we only have a limited amount of dollars each year that we can get. So Brenda, if you could start our slide. And feel free to put a question in the chat if you have one while they're coming up. Okay, so the purpose of HYLF's grant is to improve the quality and availability of legal aid, health, human services, and education services provided by Greater Houston nonprofit organizations. So we specifically fund things that fall into these 4 categories. So in the process of reviewing the grants, the very first thing that we are going to do is see, can we fit your grant project into one of these boxes? If it does not fit into one of these boxes, no matter how great the cause is, no matter how great the project is, we are not going to be able to fund it. So to the extent that you are looking for funding through HYLF, I would try your best to look at these stated purposes and see best where your project can fit in. So the first is the furtherance of justice and legal education through sponsorship and encouragement of legal research, publications, institutions, and forums. The second is the support of legal aid programs for the indigent and or working poor and the optimization of aid grants from governmental and private sources. The third is the support of youth through athletic and educational forums. And the fourth is any other activity that will promote and aid an improved system for the administration of justice and improvement of the bench bar in the greater Houston area. So that's kind of our big catch-all phrase that we can get, grants to fall into. But when you are thinking about applying for our process, especially if you're not like a legal focus, most of our programs are going to fall in the third and fourth category. And as Brenda stated earlier, you must serve the people of the greater Houston area. So if this is a national project or a Dallas-based project, that's not really going to count. We're really looking at, Houston area, but, Pearland, Sugar Land, those places, that counts. So with the HYLF grants, we can award the full amount of the funds requested, or we can also do partial awards. So we have a maximum award that we will give per grant, and I believe that's $15,000. We do not give a lot of those. So just a heads up on that. A lot of ours are partial funding or just smaller projects that are less in amount. Awards of funds on a matching basis where HYLF will match funds up to a designated maximum amount in proportion to the grant recipient's ability to raise new funds from other sources. We've never done that before. It's not to say that we won't in the future. It's just most of our grants fall under the full award or the partial award basis. But just definitely be cognizant of your ask because, like I said, the max amount is $15,000. And I feel like last year we got a lot of applications that were asking for that max amount, and we just don't have enough funding to fund a lot of projects all at that same high level. So I would say on average, maybe most of our grants are funded between like the $3,000 and $5,000 level. So the eligibility criteria for our grants is that it must serve and benefit individuals in the greater Houston area. We prefer to fund projects from nonprofit organizations, and you'll see in our application, we will ask what type of organization you are, whether you're a 501c3 or what have you. We've had some grant applications in the past for like for-profit entities, and it does make our grant committee do a second look just to make sure that these funds are really going towards a proper purpose. So to the extent that you are not a nonprofit organization applying for a grant, I would put maybe a little bit more extra explanation into the structure of your organization so that we can really make sure that these funds are going towards good sources. We prefer to fund projects of limited duration. So that means that we like to provide funding for, ABC's Children's Fund organization for the summer of 2023, so that we can say, HYLF sponsored kids at this time, this place, and we can measure that. We like to have our name on it, and that is one of the criterias, is to say that you received your funding from HYLF in some acknowledgement way. And so selfishly, we like to be able to fund a discrete project that we can say, hey, look, this is what we did, rather than we gave 5% of, a max budget of this for a project that's been going over 20 years. That doesn't really help us quantify our help in the community. So grants will not be awarded to projects that require funding in excess of 2 years from implementation to completion. Funds may also not be used to supplement or extend an organization's operation budget. So we do not pay salaries. It is not we will not support a project that is, let us hire X person and pay their salary this much, or we're trying to raise funding for this salary, or trying to raise funding for this building. That usually is not going to be funded. We prefer to fund new projects or projects that will substantially and substantively change or be enhanced through the application of the HYLF funds. So like I said, we like to start things and help people really get off with new projects. If you have a project that's been around for 15 years and you're just continuing and want more money to keep that program sustaining, the HYLF grant may not be the best place for that project. But if you can find a new something within that project, like, yes, we've had this program continuing, but we need a new X, and that will help us. We need new computers. We need a kitchen set to teach children with special needs how to cook, that type of thing. Within larger organizations, we have funded in the past. So on the grant limits, I touched on this earlier. The minimum amount is 500. The maximum amount is 15,000. Partial awards may be granted. Like I said, typically the grants that we do award are in the $3,500 to $5,000 range. And the grant awards must be administered by the applicant organization, and they will not be made for the purpose of payment to third-party organizations. So some additional considerations of just giving you some insight of what we look at when we are reviewing the projects. We want to see that your project is following in one of those 4 stated purposes. We want you to be able to achieve the objectives that are evidenced by past performance, but obviously we understand that there are new organizations. So if you don't have past performance, give us projected performance. We like to measure our success and measure our dollars. So for example, we like to be able to say, okay, how many people did we help this year through our grant program? How many children, how many lives have we touched? And so the best that you can show that to us and break it down, that will help. And that feeds directly into the next one, the number of community members who will directly benefit from the project. The relationship of the proposed project to similar ongoing charitable outreach projects and community service events. So to the extent that your organization does something that somebody else does, is yours complementary? Is it conflicting, competitive, duplicative? That's something that we consider. We like to see specific and fixed calendar framework for project phases and completion to the best you can. I mean, obviously, we're still coming out of COVID, and we had grant projects that were funded for a certain time period, and that just didn't happen because of COVID, and things couldn't happen in person. We're pretty flexible on that end. If something happens after you get the grant project award, email us. We usually always have to take it to a board vote, and the board has always said, yes, we will give you more time, or we will give you this to complete your project. Let's see. So other sources of funding, HYLF doesn't like to be the small fish in the big pond. And so if you're getting funding from Bank of America and Exxon and Shell and, the JP Morgan Foundation, and then HYLF is just going to be this small little contribution, we can't really see our measured success and difference. And so I really do feel like we like those smaller projects, not necessarily smaller organizations, but we just want to see our dollars make a difference. Next slide. So we prefer not to fund these bullet points. And so when you're envisioning your project that you are seeking funding for, make sure that you're not one of these bullet points. So galas or gala type events, organizations that in turn provide money to somebody else, activities whose sole purpose is the promotion or support of a specific religion, denomination, or church. It's not to say that we have not funded church-like programs in the past, but those projects have been non-denominational in reach. It might be a religious organization that is putting on this project and seeking funding for this project, but it's not in furtherance of the relationship, or it's not in furtherance of the religion, but it's outreach to a certain deserving community, low-income people that we like to help. But to the extent that we're like, is this really religious and is this, basically Sunday school, something like that, it likely will not get funded. So we also do not like to fund guest speakers, panelists, memorials for individual salaries. We covered that. Purchase of office equipment or other fixed assets. Now, there's a difference between, I talked about like the kitchen set and laptops. Those projects were not office equipment, but rather they were used in furtherance of the project. For example, teaching special needs children how to cook and be independent. And so they needed kitchen equipment. The laptops that we funded was for, I think it was for foster children in communication when they were getting legal aid. And so the laptops were used for the project. It wasn't necessarily that me, the employee of that nonprofit, was using the laptop for my own purpose, but rather it was in furtherance of the project. And grants may not be made outside of the greater Houston area, but your reach can be beyond Houston. So this is the application process. I'm not going to walk through all the details of it because it will be available on our website, but we're going to have a Google form where you can go in and it will prompt you with questions throughout the process. And then once your application is submitted, HYLF will take those applications to our grant committee, and our grant committee will then be in charge of reviewing all of the applications. We will have a big meeting where we discuss every single application submitted, and we ultimately vote on which applications get approved for funding. Conditions of the grant. So we do ask that you recognize the foundation and any printed materials or video audios that you use to promote your project. And all it is a quick, this project was made possible by a grant from the Houston Young Lawyers Foundation. And so at the end of the year, we do require a final report just to tell us how the funds were used and how the project turned out. So we have some upcoming deadlines that you may be interested in. So the application should be opening at the end of this week on Friday. The applications will be open for a month-long period and due March 17th. And then the Board of Trustees will approve that, so in between March 17th and April 5th, the Grants Committee will meet and review the applications and vote on which applications they believe should be funded. And from there, we will present it to the HYLF Board of Trustees for approval on April 5th, and then notify you around mid-May. You can find our applications online. Here's the website, hylf.org/grants, and please use the grant program guidelines when you're filling it out. And so if the applications do not comply with our guidelines, then they will not be considered. And I know Ross said earlier that he's never had a program come back and ask follow-up questions. We actually have. We did that last year. One reason why we asked Ross to come in this year to give a little bit of guidance on the grant application process was last year we felt some of our grant applications were a little bit sparse. We did, in years past, we did get the applications that were pages and pages long, which were too voluminous and too hard for our grant committee to go through. But then, so we tried to narrow our application, but then we didn't get enough information from our grant applications. So we did have to go back to certain people and say, can you provide us a budget? We didn't see a budget on this. How are our funds going to be used? Or can you provide us X? I saw in Ross's presentation where he was just saying, hey, give us the quick, like, what's your mission statement? What's this? You will actually see like a prompted question in our application for a brief description of your organization. You have no idea how hard that is to really find out what an organization does by their website, because so many times the mission statement is this, big idea of, what you want to be in life, but we're like, okay, but wait, what do they do? And so we are asking you to tell us what you do so that we do not have to sparse through your application and your website to figure out, oh, okay, they help people do X. They help people with Y. They aid domestic violence victims through the legal process in court. Like, it seems intuitive that you know your organization best, but we really need you to help us with some of that information. So some of the questions may be, well, duh, this is what we do, but it's really just to help us with the process. Is that my last slide? Okay, great. So if you have any questions about the HYLF grant application process, please let me know. There was a question to have Ross's email and the grant search site sent in a follow-up email. If Lucy, you could do that.
Yeah, we can handle that. And the grants email, if anyone has any questions, I'm putting that in the chat. It's grants@hylf.org. So we'll be monitoring that for any questions as well. Thank you, Leah, for chairing the grant committee year in and year out. We really appreciate your work with the HYLF grant program. I don't see any specific questions about our application. So if there's none, thank you everyone for coming and attending this webinar series.